they used to.
While his mother, Janet, struggled to find her place. By the time Tom was just 4 years old, his parents' marriage dissolved, not with dramatic explosions, while his youngest brother stayed with their mother. From then on, Tom's childhood was one of constant change. By the time he was 10 years old, he had already lived in 10 different homes. Most were cramped rentals, their peeling paint and worn furniture carrying the ghosts of past tenants. His meals were simple, enough to keep him alive, but never enough to fill the hollowness inside. Every move meant another new school, another set of unfamiliar faces, another lunch eaten in isolation. He wore the same clothes until they began to fray, and learned early the art of staying out of the way. "I was a geek, an outsider," he would later admit. But those words were a quiet mask for something much heavier. For Tom, home was never a place. It was a suitcase. And yet, amid the uncertainty and scarcity, there was one place he found refuge: the stage. In school auditoriums with squeaky floors and buzzing lights, he discovered that acting gave him something his real life never could: belonging. When the audience clapped, it wasn't just applause. It was oxygen. It was proof that someone had noticed him, that for a fleeting moment he mattered. But when the curtains closed and the lights went out, the loneliness always returned. Looking back years later, he would describe his childhood in one heartbreaking word: lonely. From the man who would later embody love, empathy, and compassion on screen, that word feels almost unbearable. Yet it was precisely in that loneliness that Tom made a quiet vow. If he ever found his voice, he would use it to make others feel seen, to protect them from the same invisibility that had shaped his own life. That vow, born from the hunger for belonging, would guide him through every performance, every act of kindness, and every storm he would one day face. Adulthood did not arrive as a rescue for Tom Hanks. Instead, it came cloaked in another form of loneliness. At just 21, in 1977, Tom stepped out into the world carrying little more than a battered suitcase, an old typewriter, and the fragile hope that he could carve a place for himself in a city that often chewed up dreamers and left them forgotten. He had dropped out of Sacramento State University, convinced that his calling lay not in textbooks, but on the stage. So he boarded a bus to New York, a city that looked magical in postcards, but up close revealed itself as brutally indifferent. The lights were dazzling, but they illuminated nothing for those who had no connections, no money, and no safety net. The reality was harsher than anything he could have imagined. Rent consumed most of what little he had. The apartments he shared were small, often so cramped that sleeping arrangements rotated between floors, couches, and occasionally borrowed mattresses. Nights were cold, meals were meager, and hunger became an unwelcome companion. Casting calls became his lifeline, the only path forward. But most auditions ended the same way, in silence. Years later, Tom would recall walking out of those rooms convinced that casting directors saw nothing in him but a skinny kid with a quirky voice. Someone lacking the sharpness or swagger Hollywood seemed to demand. His kindness, the very quality that would one day make him beloved, was at that time almost a liability. "I learned early on that the room didn't need me," he once admitted quietly. And carrying that realization back to a lonely apartment each night was almost unbearable. Yet rejection did not crush him. It carved him. Tom accepted every opportunity, no matter how small or unglamorous. He took bit parts in off-Broadway plays, even roles that paid little more than cab fare. In 1980, he appeared in a low-budget horror film, He Knows You're Alone. The movie wasn't destined for glory, but it offered him enough to pay rent and stay afloat. When opportunities in New York grew scarce, he turned to Cleveland, where he worked at the Great Lakes Theater Festival in the late 1970s. There, he did it all: acting in productions, building sets, hanging lights, sweeping the stage. Nothing was beneath him. Years later, he would reflect, "Those years taught me everything. You show up, you work, and you keep going, even if no one notices." By 1980, at just 24 years old, his persistence finally cracked open a door. He landed a role in the quirky sitcom Bosom Buddies, a show that asked him to dress in women's clothing just so his character could secure an apartment. It was absurd, it was short-lived, and it hardly screamed future superstar. Yet for Tom, it was proof that all those sleepless nights had not been in vain. It was a crack in the wall he had been pounding for years. But even as small successes appeared, the fear of failure never left him. Every time a job ended, he wondered if the dream was over. He would picture himself back on a bus with nothing but a suitcase, searching once again for somewhere to belong. Looking back decades later, Tom admitted those early years weren't about chasing success. They were about survival. "I didn't have a plan B," he confessed. "I just knew I couldn't go back to feeling invisible." And so, the boy who had once lived in 10 different houses by the age of 10 carried that same suitcase of determination into adulthood. His invisible scars pushed him forward, urging him to hold on just a little longer, to believe that applause might once again fill the silence. At the time, no one could have guessed that this struggling young man, scraping by with bus fare in one pocket and worn-out shoes on his feet, would one day become known as the kindest soul in Hollywood. As the 1980s unfolded, the world began to notice Tom Hanks, not yet as a towering figure of Hollywood, but as a promising actor with a natural charm that seemed to flow effortlessly across the screen. His role in Bosom Buddies had opened the first crack in the wall, and soon more opportunities followed. At first, they came in the form of lighthearted comedies. Movies like Splash, 1984, showcased his comedic timing and boyish charm. Audiences laughed, critics nodded, and for a brief moment, Tom Hanks looked like he might be destined to stay in a lane of feel-good romantic comedies and quirky roles. Films such as Bachelor Party and The Money Pit gave him visibility. He earned his first Academy Award nomination, a signal that Hollywood was beginning to see him not merely as a comedic lead, but as an actor with extraordinary range. Yet the path from comedy to drama was not without cost. With every role that lifted him higher, something deeper was demanded of him: his body, his mind, his spirit. Fame, as it often does, came with a hidden toll. When Tom took on the role of Andrew Beckett in Philadelphia, 1993, it required not only talent but immense courage to portray a man battling stigma and discrimination. Tom shed nearly 35 pounds. The physical transformation was grueling, but what lingered was not just the weight he lost. It was the emotional burden of stepping into a story that mirrored real-world pain. The chill of that role stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The following year brought what would become perhaps his most iconic performance, Forrest Gump. The world fell in love with the simplicity, purity, and quiet wisdom of a man who walked through history with unshakable grace. Yet even here, behind the warmth, Tom made a daring choice that revealed another side of his determination. Instead of accepting a fixed $7 million salary, he negotiated for a share of the film's gross. It was a risky decision, but one that ultimately paid off, bringing him more than $70 million. Still, even success like that came with its own kind of weight. Every triumph raised the expectations higher. Every applause turned into a silent demand for the next masterpiece. For Tom, it was no longer just about acting. It was about living up to an image that the world had come to expect: America's everyman, the embodiment of decency, the actor who could never fail. By the time he starred in Saving Private Ryan, 1998, directed by Steven Spielberg, the roles had become heavier, not just in terms of acting, but in moral responsibility. Tom held on to the vow he had made as a lonely boy, that if he ever had a voice, he would use it to make others feel seen. Even when the pressure mounted, even when the applause became a burden, he kept faith with his craft. Because for him, acting was never just a job, it was a responsibility. Even as Tom Hanks conquered Hollywood screens, his personal life told a different story, one marked not by triumph, but by fragility, missteps, and regret. Long before he became the actor the world admired, Tom was just a frightened young man searching for stability, desperate to build a home that would not shatter the way his childhood had. At the tender age of 21, Tom married Samantha Lewis, one that planted the seeds of sorrow that would follow him for years. As his career began to demand more of his time, the cracks in their relationship widened. Samantha, gentle yet burdened, slowly faded behind the growing whirlwind of Tom's life. In 1987, after years of strain, the marriage ended in divorce. For the world, it was just another Hollywood breakup. For Tom, it was devastating because this was not merely the end of a marriage. It was the reopening of an old wound. He had once sworn that the cycle of fractured families would end with him. Yet now, he watched his own children, Colin and Elizabeth, live between two homes, just as he once had. The irony was bitter. To millions, Tom Hanks would later become the symbol of fatherhood, the reassuring presence of America's dad. But in private, he feared he had failed at the role that mattered most. There were nights when applause on set echoed back at him as something hollow. Still carrying the guilt of a young boy who had vowed to protect but could not keep the world from hurting someone he loved. He would later admit that some failures never truly leave. They live quietly in the heart, teaching us to show kindness even when kindness cannot change the ending. This was not the Tom Hanks that the public knew. It was not a story splashed across tabloids. It was quieter, heavier, the story of a man trying, failing, and still carrying the weight of those failures. While cameras recorded the rise of a legend, behind them stood a father asking himself the most painful question of all: was love by itself ever enough? And just when it seemed that Tom might never find peace, life offered him another chance, this time in the form of a love that would endure storms, illnesses, and trials far greater than anything he had faced before. After the quiet devastation of his first marriage, Tom Hanks could have easily closed his heart, fearful of repeating old mistakes. Yet life had other plans. In 1981, while working on the sitcom Bosom Buddies, Tom met actress Rita Wilson. At the time, sparks were subtle, more professional than personal. Years later, however, destiny brought them together again when they co-starred in the film Volunteers, 1985. This time, the connection was undeniable. Where his first marriage had been rushed and fragile, his bond with Rita was something different, patient, steady, and genuine. They grew to understand one another slowly, learning each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. She was not simply a partner. She was a mirror to his soul, someone who understood the fears he seldom named, the regrets he carried quietly, and the ache that never quite faded from his childhood. In 1988, just a year after his divorce, Tom and Rita married. Their relationship quickly became one of Hollywood's rare enduring love stories. For decades, the world has watched them walk red carpets hand in hand, share smiles at premieres, and build a family that seemed to embody stability in an industry where marriages often collapse under pressure. But what made their union truly remarkable was not the public image. It was how they faced life's most brutal storms together. In 2015, that bond was tested in the harshest way. Rita was diagnosed with breast cancer, a revelation that shook their world to its core. For Tom, the woman who had been his anchor, his muse, and his closest friend was suddenly fighting for her life. Rita underwent a double mastectomy and reconstructive surgery, a journey that demanded courage by the hour. For the first time in decades, Tom could not shield her from the pain. Fame, scripts, and fortune meant nothing in the face of such a battle. All that mattered was standing by her side. He accompanied her to appointments, held her hand when her body faltered, whispered encouragement in the moments she wanted to give up, and wept in private when fear threatened to overwhelm him. Later, in carefully chosen words, he confessed that Rita had saved his life more times than he could count, and that the least he could do was remain by her side through her darkest hour. Their home became a battlefield, not of fame or success, but of survival, fought with medicine, faith, and unshakable love. They emerged victorious. Rita survived, though the scars remained, both visible and invisible. And with survival came a quiet awareness. Once shaken like that, you never again mistake calm for certainty. Tom, who had already been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 2013, now lived with sharper vigilance. knowing that every new illness posed greater risks. Just 5 years later, in 2020, another storm arrived. While Tom was filming in Australia, he and Rita became among the first public figures to test positive for COVID-19. The world, already panicked, now saw even its most beloved Hollywood couple caught in the grip of a mysterious illness. For Rita, symptoms hit hard: loss of taste and smell, endless fatigue, and fever that lingered far longer than expected. For Tom, then 63 and already living with diabetes, the diagnosis was terrifying. In those long nights of isolation, far from home, he confessed to writing quiet letters of farewell, prepared, just in case, that his family would one day have to read them, not out of panic, but from a sober understanding of mortality. Yet once again, they fought together. In an isolated hospital room, their world shrank to 4 sterile walls and the bond between them. Tom stayed strong not because fear was absent, but because Rita needed him to be. He kept a journal, sent messages of hope to worried fans, and found small ways to coax a smile from Rita even when she could barely sit up. The ordeal left them changed. Tom's body, already strained by years of illness, never quite returned to its former resilience. Simple walks left him winded, joints ached, and fatigue lingered like a shadow. But even through exhaustion, what endured most was their devotion. Later, Tom would say that when two people walk through fire together, there is little left to fear. Their love was not scripted fantasy. It was messy, raw, and refined by trials. It endured not because life was easy, but because they both knew what it meant to nearly lose everything. That knowledge sharpened their devotion instead of dulling it. Behind the red carpet smiles, behind the viral moments of kindness, there stood a man and woman who had weathered storms that would have torn apart lesser bonds. Their marriage was never about perfection. It was about resilience. Not merely a love story, but a survival story written in quiet whispers of care. To the world, Tom Hanks became the face of dignity, humility, and warmth. Millions called him America's dad, a man who embodied compassion on screen in ways that made people feel safe, understood, and less alone. But behind the curtain, Tom carried burdens that no award or applause could ease. The complicated, often painful realities of being a father. His children were born into a world that looked dazzling from the outside. Fame, wealth, opportunity, everything seemed within their reach. Yet even privilege cannot shield a child from struggle, nor can it guarantee the stability that a father so desperately hopes to provide. For Colin and Elizabeth, his children from his first marriage, Tom often feared he had already failed. Divorce had forced them into a life split between two households, a wound Tom knew all too well from his own childhood. Though he worked hard to stay present, he carried guilt that his career had often pulled him away, leaving silence where words of comfort should have been. But perhaps his deepest heartbreak came through his son, Chet. Born into a family where compassion, decency, and perseverance were core values, Chet nonetheless drifted onto a more troubled path. For Tom, who had spent a lifetime trying to break free from the chaos of his own upbringing, watching his son struggle felt like history knocking on his door again. Chet's life soon filled with rebellion, substance abuse, and public controversies that transformed private worry into public humiliation. In 2015, Tom quietly supported him through rehab, hoping that recovery would take root. But recovery is not a switch, it is a road, and Chet stumbled often. Headlines soon followed: angry outbursts, troubling social media posts. Had his success blinded him to his son's pain? Had the legacy he built become a burden that pressed down harder than comfort could lift? These questions haunted him far more than any film review ever could. Yet through it all, Tom never turned away. He did not disown. He did not rage. He did not hide. He stayed present quietly. Reminders of the painful truth every parent must face. Love cannot always save your child, but it must never stop trying. This was not a role Tom could prepare for with a script. It was not a story that ended neatly with applause. It was unscripted life, where the stakes were not about box office numbers or awards, but about soul-defining questions of fatherhood. And in this unscripted role, Tom Hanks carried on as he always had, heartbroken, hopeful, and holding on. Even at the peak of his career, behind the Hollywood glow, he was simply a father wrestling with questions that cut deeper than any critic's words. Could he have done more? Did his children know, truly know, how deeply he loved them? And those questions, heavier than any Oscar, remained. By the time Tom Hanks entered his late 60s, the world saw him as a living legend. His career had spanned decades, his films had shaped culture, and his kindness had made him universally beloved. Yet behind the polished glow of success, Tom was carrying struggles that no red carpet or standing ovation could erase. In 2013, he revealed publicly that he had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. For many, it was a passing headline, but for Tom, it became a daily, lifelong battle. Managing the disease meant strict routines, constant monitoring, and the awareness that a single misstep could spiral into something far more dangerous. It was a cruel irony. After years of reshaping his body for roles like Philadelphia and Castaway, he now found himself waging a battle that no script could capture. The fight was quiet, often invisible. The needles, the dietary restrictions, the fatigue that arrived uninvited. These are not details the world ever saw. To the public, he was still the charismatic elder statesman of Hollywood. But in private, there were days when simply walking left him winded, when joints ached with an unfamiliar persistence, when recovery from even small illnesses seemed to take longer than it once had. And then came the pandemic. In 2020, as the world faced fear and uncertainty, Tom and Rita Wilson became among the first global celebrities to contract COVID-19. Their illness instantly turned into worldwide news. For fans, it was a startling reminder that even Hollywood icons were vulnerable. For Tom, already living with diabetes, the diagnosis carried an edge of mortality. In hospital isolation, with sterile walls closing in, Tom confessed to writing quiet letters of farewell, not out of panic, but out of sober preparation. He knew that life is fragile, and that illness has a way of reshaping everything in an instant. It was in those moments that the world's gentlest soul confronted the possibility of leaving behind the love of his life, the children he still worried about, and the unfinished story he was still trying to write. Though he and Rita recovered, the experience left deep marks. His body no longer bounced back as it once had. Fatigue lingered, small tasks demanded more energy, and questions about his future as an actor grew louder. Could he still play the roles he once did? Could he still carry the weight of being a symbol of strength when, in truth, he sometimes felt fragile himself? But perhaps the hardest part of aging was not the illness. It was the isolation that fame itself created. Tom had spoken openly about the loneliness that accompanied his career, even at its height. After premieres and ovations, he often returned to hotel rooms where silence pressed too heavily. Respect, he once admitted, can be a lonely crown. Perfectionism, the very trait that had lifted him to greatness, also became a relentless tormentor. Every line, every performance, every misstep was second-guessed. Even after decades of iconic roles, he confessed to fearing that he might no longer be enough, that audiences cherish him for yesterday, while today quietly slipped away. And beneath it all lay the sharpest ache of all, the repetition of a childhood wound. Despite his efforts to give his children a more stable life, Tom had watched familiar patterns emerge. Colin, though successful in his own right, was often measured against his father's towering legacy. Chet battled addiction and public scrutiny, and Tom, despite his fame, carried the guilt of wondering whether he had passed down fragments of the same instability that had haunted him as a boy. The kindness for which he was celebrated, the quality that seemed to flow so naturally from him, was in truth born from those wounds. Tom knew what it felt like to be unseen, to feel left behind. And so he poured his time, his money, his energy into others, supporting charities, offering his presence, giving to causes quietly and consistently. But even generosity carries its own quiet toll. For a man who keeps giving may forget to leave room for his own healing. Still, Tom Hanks pressed forward. His battles were not explosive or scandalous. They were subtle, slow, and deeply human. And through them all, he carried himself with grace, seldom showing the weight he bore. Because for Tom, peace was not something to be won. It was something to be practiced every day. And though time, yet his sanctuary is not limited to California. Across the sea, on the Greek island of Antiparos, stands another home, a 450-square-meter stone retreat surrounded by olive trees and kissed by the Mediterranean breeze. There, time slows. Summers on Antiparos are spent not in glittering galas, but in quiet walks, shared meals, and moments of reflection. The island offers Tom and Rita the simplicity they crave, a reminder that the most meaningful life is not built on fame, but on connection. At the core of Tom's later years is his marriage to Rita Wilson, a union forged in hardship and tempered by time. Their bond is not one of cinematic perfection, but of real devotion. Together they have faced breast cancer, COVID-19, diabetes, the turbulence of raising children in the public eye, and the relentless demands of fame. And yet, hand in hand, they remain. Rita is more than a partner. She is a co-pilot, a muse, and a mirror to his soul. Their marriage, among the most enduring in Hollywood, is the cornerstone of the calm he now carries. As a father, Tom has also leaned into presence. He remains closely connected to Colin, Elizabeth, Chet, and Truman, supporting them not as a judge, but as a compass. He beams with pride at Colin's steady career, respects Elizabeth's private nature, continues to hope for Chet's stability and growth, and guides Truman as he steps into adulthood. Tom no longer strives for perfection in fatherhood. He strives for presence, showing up in ways that matter, even if the past cannot be undone. Financially, Tom Hanks stands among the wealthiest figures in Hollywood, with an estimated net worth of $400 million. His bold decision to take a share of Forrest Gump's profits rather than a flat salary remains legendary, reportedly earning him more than $70 million from that film alone. But wealth for Tom is not a trophy, it is a tool. He has invested in historic properties, coastal retreats, and even a nostalgic houseboat that once sheltered him during his youth in the Bay Area. These are not just financial assets. They are reminders of chapters in his story, symbols of survival and growth. More importantly, Tom has used his wealth as a force for good. Philanthropy has become central to his later years. From cancer research and homelessness relief to arts education and humanitarian causes, Tom and Rita give quietly, consistently, and humbly. Their donations have supported hospitals, schools, and organizations that fight to give dignity and opportunity to others. For Tom, generosity is not performance, it is presence. It is a way of keeping his vow to make others feel seen. And though he no longer chases roles the way he once did, Tom remains a powerful presence in the arts. He chooses projects with emotional and cultural weight, like A Man Called Otto, and continues his creative partnership with Steven Spielberg. He has also embraced new forms of expression, lending his voice to podcasts, writing essays, and crafting stories about history and humanity. His public voice has grown quieter, but also deeper, more reflective. The clearest signature of his life now is the calm it carries. He walks with measured steps, drives himself through Los Angeles traffic in vintage and electric cars, takes long walks beside Rita, and laughs with fans he meets along the way. He no longer seeks to dazzle. He seeks to endure, to reflect, to leave behind something gentler than the glitter of fame. What Tom Hanks has chosen in these later years is not the pursuit of greatness. He already achieved that long ago. What he seeks now is peace. And perhaps that is the greatest triumph of all. When we look at Tom Hanks today, it is tempting to measure his greatness by the roles he has played, the awards he has won, or the fortune he has amassed. But to do so would be to miss the essence of what makes his story so deeply human, so profoundly moving. Tom Hanks' true legacy is not in trophies or box office numbers. It is in the way he has lived, the discipline of kindness he has practiced, and the integrity he has chosen day after day. Unlike many of his peers, Tom never treated kindness as a performance. He treated it as a discipline.